Alright, y'all got me? There we go. Welcome back to another episode of BassQuest, everybody. Today we're going to break down how to find big winter fish on Chickamauga. But first, we're going to go through the map study for the lipless video because a lot of you guys didn't get to see that. So the first thing I want to talk about is my setup. I got a couple questions on that in the comments on the last video. What I use throwing these lipless baits, now this is in the colder water. I use a jerkbait rod. This is actually a crank jerkbait rod. It's made for like small body cranks and jerkbaits. It's a 7-foot and it says it's a medium heavy. This is a TCS okuma. It says it's a medium heavy, but I would call it more of a medium, and it's a moderate fast action rod. Then I use a Lew's Team Lite reel. This is a really small, low profile reel, and it's very smooth. It's got a centrifuge brake system so I can make long casts with really light baits. It excels at throwing lighter baits. I've got that spooled up with, it's actually not a straight fluorocarbon. This past year I switched over to using a blended line. This is K9 Fluoro. It's called Fluoro, but it's actually like a nylon blend, and what it gives you is it gives you a little bit more stretch when you're trying to catch those big fish on smaller line. It can be really nice to have a little bit of stretch in there. I still get the sensitivity I want, but when that big fish makes a run at the boat, I'm less likely to make a mistake and break them off just in case I can't get to thumb the drag in time. All right. Now, the other thing I want to talk about that I didn't mention in the video, and I don't know why I didn't, is the hooks. I don't use stock hooks on any of my lipless baits, no matter what the brand. This is a Strike King Red Eye Shad, and I've got these changed out with some Mustad Triple Grips. I like the Gami EWGs as well. And if you're fishing a 1/4 ounce trap, one of the really small ones, and getting really finessey with a spinning rod, you can actually switch to the Aaron Martin's the Finesse Nano hook is, I believe, what it's called. It's a really light wire, and it'll really hook those fish. It's a really good hook for a blade bait or for a small 1/4 ounce trap. All right. If I'm fishing around grass, I'll jump up in a rod. So if I'm trying to rip it out of grass, I want a medium heavy rod, a true medium heavy, and I want a fast action, something that's got a little bit more stiffness to it. So when I snap that, it's going to be very responsive, I should say, to snap the bait out of the grass and make sure it clears the hooks. Because with that lighter rod, it's really hard to clear the hooks sometimes. Depending on the situation, if it's really thick grass, early season, a lot of times I'm going to run that braid on there. Sometimes I'll even run a straight braid on it. And if it's later season, a little bit more sparse grass, I'll go to a fluorocarbon. Usually a little bit heavier pound test too. Instead of a 12, I'll bump up to maybe a 15, sometimes even a 17 on that. Just something that I can get through there. And I'll bump the hooks up as well. Sometimes I'll go to a Mustad, like a 2X triple grip hook. That way I'll make sure, even since I've got that stiffer rod, I'm not going to bend the hooks out of those fish at all. All right, so talked about the hooks. Now going through, I'm going to swap over here. Let's see here. Look at that crazy screen. Doing the map study with the lipless now. Let's see here. Now starting out, let's start out beginning of the season, early fall. What I'm going to do is find these fish. Usually you can find some mid-depth range schools. A lot of guys are ledge fishing at that point still. They're out here on the main river channel. They're on those steeper drop-offs fishing for fish in that plus 25 foot of water. I'm going to get away from that. What I'll do is I'll follow, we've got a secondary channel right here running down through here. And you can see there's inside turns and little points and nooks off of that secondary channel. A lot of times what you'll find is schools of fish that are in this mid-depth range. And what they'll do is they'll set up there, and there'll be a good-sized school of fish, and they'll get finicky a lot of times. So what you can do is you can throw that lipless out there, hop it around, and find those fish. You can also find schools of fish that are in major creeks like that, kind of on mid-depth range ledges. And again, like we just talked about, looking for sparse grass, on the outside of mats, and grass that hasn't matted up yet. Grass that has to grow all the way to the top of the water to form a mat. And a lot of times you'll have a canopy of grass, but it'll be 1 to 3 foot below the water line, and you can throw that lipless in there with some heavier gear, rip it through, and catch fish that are sitting in the grass or on top of it. A lot of times first thing in the morning, they'll be sitting on top of that there. Moving on into the fall, what happens is these fish start to push shallower on main, river flats here. They'll push shallower up into these flats. They'll follow the shad. In major creeks, again, as we've talked about in other videos, they're going to start to migrate back into the creeks here, and they're going to stop at stopping points, which are going to be these secondary points, again, shallower ledges and places like that. And you can target those fish, again, with a lipless. Sometimes they'll be shallow depending on how much current is running. Sometimes they'll be a little deeper, so your retrieve varies. But a lot of times, we're talking warmer water. If I'm going to yo-yo it, I'm going to be pretty aggressive. I'm going to be ripping that thing up. And you guys can follow along down in the description. I'm putting all this, kind of my outline for this video, in the description for all these live streams. So again, feel free to pull those off of there, print them out for your use in the future, but it kind of gives you an idea of where I'm going with this. All right, moving into the late fall. What I find in the late fall is fish tend to get much more shallow. They push way back into these backwaters here, and they'll get really shallow, and they'll follow the bait. It's pretty easy to find fish in the fall. You just follow the bait around, follow the birds around, and you can target these fish. So once you get on there, you can throw a lighter lipless bait, or like a red-eye shad, or a smaller, like a 1/4 ounce lipless bait, and you can get ultra shallow. You can fish that thing in sub 1 foot of water a lot of times and burn and stop it, or do some aggressive retrieves that are going to get those fish to react to it. Now, working on into the winter, so as you start getting into later into the fall, the water temps, they really start to fall. When I'm talking about later in the fall and into the winter, I'm talking about water temps start to drop into the low 50s. And what happens is you'll start to see the bait begin to creep its way out of the creeks again. So it'll start, you see these little creek channels here on the avionics. They're going to start working their way out on these creek channels, and they're going to stop again at all these stopping points on their way out. And so you can follow these fish out by following the bait and hit them with this lipless. Now, as they start to push their way out, again, a lot of times they'll be shallow, but a lot of times they won't be so super shallow that you can use that burn stop retrieve. You need to use a different type of bait, one that's a little heavier oftentimes. If you're fishing a little deeper, maybe a 3/4 ounce bait like an LV500, or like the 5/8 ounce, I think it's called a 6 Sense Quake. That's a really good one as well. A little bit heavier. It's going to maintain bottom contact, stay down there where those fish are. You can hop it around, pull it, drag it, however you need to do to get these fish firing. All right, then we work our way into the winter time with a lipless crankbait. When I'm thinking winter time with a lipless crank, especially in the early part of the winter, we're going to have a lot of fronts moving in and out. Water temperatures are going to kind of fall into the mid 40s, and the fish are going to be up and down. So you might have one day where you look up and there's fish busting up in 4 foot of water, and you can, again, throw that crank up there, be relatively aggressive with it, and catch fish. And then the next day a cold front comes through and you're fishing it like a blade bait in 20 foot of water, just lifting that thing slowly, just enough to engage the wobble and drop it back down. And we're talking wintertime fishing. Again, you see where I'm at here. This is around a creek mouth. So if you want to find fish during the wintertime, these creek mouths are a good place to start. Again, secondary channels. And another place that a lot of people overlook is deeper ledges that you found in the summer. So you got to think on Chickamauga, you've got this wintertime drawdown, right? The water is going to be roughly 7 to 8 feet lower than it is in the summertime. So actually lower than what we're seeing right here. So those ledges that you were catching fish on in 15, 18 feet of water are really not deep enough to hold these fish. You're looking for a ledge that's going to be deeper, so a ledge that's in, you caught fish in the summertime that was 25 foot of water, 28 foot of water. Those kind of ledges can produce relatively well in the wintertime as well. We got any questions coming in here? Y'all feel free to just stick some questions down there. I'm going to be kind of looking over as I'm going, so if I do something dumb or something doesn't make sense, go ahead and hit me with a question down there. All right, so I think that's pretty much all I want to say on the lipless cranks. Well, we'll go on further. So, we're talking about spring now. We get late winter, early pre-spawn. The fish, days get shorter, or days get longer, I should say. They're going to start to push shallow. So we're at these creek mouths again, or we're on these secondary channels right here. And what happens is these fish are going to, once again, they're going to start to push shallow. But the interesting thing this time is it's not going to be related to bait. So a lot of times what you'll notice is the shad will remain out here in these secondary channels or in these creek channels, but the bigger fish and a lot of the bass will go ahead and begin this migration back into the creeks or into these backwater areas to go ahead and get ready to stage up to spawn. So I've had times, especially in February, where these fish get pushed way back into a backwater, and you're wondering why the heck they're there because there's no bait around or anything, but they're staging up and getting ready. Another cool thing about that is the bigger fish start to group together, and so you can really target. Instead of just catching one lone solitary big fish, you can catch 3, 4, 5 in a row because they'll be schooled up. And that continues on into March. We start to get into the pre-spawn period into March there, and that's the exact same thing. Those fish are going to, more and more waves of fish are going to begin to move up into these backwater areas, into these creeks, and they're going to be pushing back, hitting all these secondary places on the way. There's more and more waves are going to get back there, and you can get fresh fish. But again, you got to cover water to find them. They're always on the move. And a lot of times during this period, we have a lot of storms and things like that, so it can be difficult to track them. Once you get into the spawn, again, I kind of mentioned this briefly in my video, you get into April, a few of these fish go on bed, and there's always kind of like a segment of the lake as far as a population of fish that are going to go on bed sooner. So they get into these backwaters. These fish get into a little gut here. They go on bed. What happens is the water is still rising at that point. It'll rise up quite a few feet over top of them, so they might be in 6, 7 foot of water. You can't see to sight fish those fish, but something like a lipless, if you're dragging it along, hopping it, it's something loud, obnoxious, and intrusive, and those fish will sometimes they'll tag it, and a lot of times they won't really eat it good or they won't eat it at all, but it's like, well, I got a bite right there. There's probably a fish on bed. You can throw another presentation in there a few times, potentially pick that fish off of that bed. And then the other time that I mentioned in that video when I throw a lipless is when you get into the shad spawn. And the shad spawn is kind of a difficult thing to show on this map here. There's a big one that happens up in the northern part of the lake. I've seen shad spawns in creeks. A lot of these major creeks, you get on these 45-degree banks around docks and things like that, you'll have a shad spawn, but you'll also have it out on flats like this. You'll have shad spawns main lake on bluff walls, main lake on flats with grass on them. So I can't really show you and just pinpoint where, exactly where a shad spawn is going to be. What I can tell you is get out there before daylight, start hunting around in some likely areas. When you start seeing birds, you start hearing bait flickering because it's pretty obvious when it's happening. You can go ahead and get on those fish, but the key thing I can tell you to do later in the season like that is to get out there as soon as possible, before daylight if possible. That way you can go ahead and find where those shad are spawning. And the last few years, a lot of times these shad spawns have been prolonged and they've been in the same areas. So what you can do once you find a shad spawn happening, a lot of times week after week, for at least a couple or 3 weeks, you can find those fish in that area. Got any more live chats down there? Anybody want to ask any questions or anything? Don't be shy. Unless you just want to hear me talk the whole time. All right, so now we're kind of out of talking about the lipless cranks here. Now we're going to specifically just talk about where to target and find fish during the winter time on this lake, and with any technique. So there's a few ways. Again, I like to break things up into different segments. It helps me understand things better. It helps me categorize what I'm doing out there. And so we're going to stay kind of in the same area, I guess, around Chester Frost. But first things first, we talked about this a second ago, early winter time. Early winter time to me, we're getting into December, first part of December. Water temps, typically what I find is water temps are in the 50s, but it's not very stable. Again, we talked about when you have this seasonal change, whether it's going from fall to winter or winter to spring, on these seasonal changes, you get a lot of fronts that move through this area. And really anywhere on the Tennessee River, there's a lot of fronts that push through. And when you have fronts, you have, drops, rises and drops in barometric pressure, but you also have usually rainfall, and that affects the current. So if you get a big front that comes through, drops a lot of rain, it can blow out the lake because that TVA has to run so much current through the dams. And in addition to that, at that point, you've still got the water dropping relatively steadily via TVA trying to get this thing down to winter pool. So what can happen is if you're getting a lot of fronts through like we had this year, you get this constant up and down fluctuation of water where water's coming in and they're trying to drop it like crazy to get back down to that winter pool. And so you're running high current, you've got high and low water, and you really have to pay attention to, is the water rising, is the water falling, and finding areas that are going to be consistent to find fish. Now, typically during that time, if you're looking for a consistent area, to me, let's say you come out one day and there's fish way up on this flat. It's 3 foot of water. Well, if they drop the water a foot in a couple days, those fish could be way down here. They migrate 2, 3, 4, 500 yards within a couple days, within a few hours even, if that water is falling. And the same thing if it's rising. That's not a consistent bite either because those fish are going to push up as far as that goes when the water is rising. Whereas if you find a school of fish, let's see right here, on a point like this in a secondary area, you see how close these contour lines are together. This is a point that's, we lose the stream here. Can y'all hear me? Y'all got me here? Trying to find you. Somebody's comment down there. Y'all got me? I'm showing that we've got low output on the stream right now. Can you hear me? Hola, ¿cómo está? Okay, all right, looking. For some reason, my other live chat is not updating here. Oh, wow, so you guys were probably trying to ask me some questions. Sorry, guys, I was running the live chat on my phone, and it was not updating. So none of you guys got to get your questions answered.